bit differently today. I'll just press got it on this message. Yeah, cool. Yeah, we're going to do it a little bit differently today. We thought that we might, Jemima and I thought that we might have a discussion, a more free-flowing discussion, and see where the discussion takes us with our different but intersecting views of the work of Gary Becker and our different disciplinary locations as well. Given that we do have only a small group today, Jemima, how would you feel too about after you've done your presentation and we commence our discussion? Would you feel okay about just opening that discussion more broadly to everybody rather than having it as a discussion just between us? What do you think?
Yeah, I can do that. Yeah, happy to go with that.
I know we've kind of mapped out some topics and questions that we'd like to discuss, but we can keep an eye on that as we progress, and if other people would like to ask questions or join in and with your own perspectives, that might be good too. So we'll see if we can do it a bit like a open discussion podcast kind of thing. So to begin, let me acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Woiwurrung language group of the Kulin Nation, where I am located today. And it's important as Australians that we pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded by the Wurundjeri people on the land where I'm speaking from today. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of context for today's discussion, and perhaps also for those people who are watching later on the video. As you know, this webinar is organised by the History of Economic Society and the MA, the Master's program in the Theory and History of Economics at the University of Leon. And as you guys already know, but perhaps people will join us later on the video listening to, so it's worth saying that the motivation for the webinar was to bring together historians of economic thought, applied economists, demographers, political and critical theorists. So not just historians of economic thought or economists, but people from a variety of different disciplinary backgrounds to consider the economics of reproductive rights in contemporary and historical context. So I quite enjoyed the openness to plural disciplines, plural perspectives in the webinar. So we don't just have people from all across different places today, but also different disciplinary backgrounds. And we've heard Marianne Johnson provide insight into the family limitation debates in Sweden in the 19th century. I tried to build on that by considering the Victorian family limitation debates and the economists who contributed to those debates, with a focus on Alfred Marshall. We've been privileged to hear Caitlin Myers speak about the economic research studying 50 years of abortion policy in the US. And we've heard from Mayra Pinedas-Torres, who looked at the legal aspects governing access to reproductive technologies and abortion. And so I guess we're discovering as we progress that reproductive rights have been conceptualized historically by economists as a function of a variety of different problems that seemed important at the time. We've seen poverty was a problem in the family limitation debates. We've seen purportedly immoral behaviours was a problem as well. We've seen a need to secure living standards for families. We've seen an interest in the 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, in gender equality and accessing work and education and in having outcomes, economic outcomes equivalent to that were equal, and abortion access, reproductive rights, access to contraception have been shown to be important elements in this. And this week, we're going to hear from Jemima Repo as to how the work of Gary Becker has had an impact on how demographers have studied reproduction and reproductive rights and population change, both in the global south, so demographers studying population in the global south, reproduction and fertility in the global south, and also demographers in Europe who might not share the same perspectives and interests, or might have different assumptions, different background conditions. So their work is going to be a bit different. And I don't know very much about demography, but we're going to hear today from Jemima, who's got expertise in demography. Now, just before we do that, let me introduce you to Jemima. So Dr. Jemima Repo is a reader in political and feminist theory in the School of Geography, Politics and Sociology at University of Newcastle. And Jemima, you wouldn't necessarily identify as an economist or as a historian of economic thought, but rather as social and political theorist, demographer, feminist theorist, and expert in biopolitics. Is that fair to say? Yeah. So we're going to have different perspectives to bring to the discussion today. And I really enjoyed her book, The Biopolitics of Gender, published by Oxford University Press, and it's worth saying that it received the International Studies Association's Feminist Theory and Gender Studies Book Award Prize, which is not to be sneezed at. That's an excellent prize. And she's currently got a 3-year research grant from the Cone Foundation to study the commodification of feminist activism. So we're very lucky to have her today, and a thank you to Jemima for joining us to talk about these issues with us, as her work's already made a significant impact and contribution to our understanding of the intersection of gender, politics, policymaking, with particular attention to the study of population and reproduction and fertility and access to reproduction, reproductive control and rights. And with that, let me turn to Jemima for you to present us main ideas in one of your papers on this topic before opening the discussion up more broadly.
First off, thank you so much, Miriam, Marianne, and Rebecca, for inviting me to speak in this forum and for the kind introduction. As Miriam said, I'm more of a political feminist theorist. I don't also have expertise in demography as such, but demography is something I've studied like as an object of my research rather than conducting demographic research. And the same goes for economy or the history of political economy. And I kind of fell into Becker completely unintentionally. So for that reason too, my reading of Becker comes from a particular place motivated by certain research interests I've had. And, you know, having sort of in preparation for this talk, I've also been re-inspired to continue that work, maybe perhaps because it had been paused by, you know, other projects coming in the way, and yeah, as it happens. So it's nice to kind of do a refresh and you know, think about all the new angles as in our previous discussion with Miriam. That was really inspiring. So, but yeah, like I said, I came to Becker really unintendedly when I was initially I was working on my PhD, so well over 10 years ago, and I was specifically, you know, at one point, it's in my book, looking at how gender equality policy was seen as the main policy solution to declining, and is still seen as the main solution to declining fertility in Europe. And European countries since the 1990s in particular had declining fertility rates on the agenda because of the threat they pose to the financial sustainability of the welfare state. So with an aging population that represented increased state expenditure combined with fewer taxpayers due to lower fertility rates of the later generations, so post-baby boomer generations, the welfare states had this demographic problem that was seen both as a workforce and economic competitiveness issue, as well as existential threat to the political system of the welfare state. And you know, I was surprised to come to Becker actually, because obviously like I'm very Foucauldian in my work, and I know Foucault's work on neoliberalism very well, as many people do. And you know, he talks about Becker in his Birth of Biopolitics lectures. And so, you know, it was one of these exciting coincidences when you're reading about demography and then realizing that these people are talking about Becker all the time, referencing Becker as kind of the cornerstone of their thought. And, you know, so I wanted to find out why was Becker then a helpful thinker for them to turn to. And so I think Becker was very, very ahead of the curve in the 1960s when he first wrote about the economic analysis of fertility. And back then he was trying to find an alternative explanation to fertility change. So he thought that existing theories of demographic transition were failing to adequately explain the latest developments in demographic transition. So demographers at the time still predicted fertility changes based on society's level of industrialization, so mode of production. So pre-industrial societies, pre-industrial societies had high levels of fertility, high levels of mortality. Then industrializing ones still had high fertility, but with lower mortality rates. And then industrialized ones were assumed to have more stabilized fertility and mortality rates. So kind of lower fertility and lower mortality. And then it was assumed that that would just kind of continue because now the sort of industrialization has kind of, we've reached this sort of, you know, point in this teleology where it kind of stabilizes, sort of almost like an end of history sort of moment. But, you know, to demographers' surprise, fertility increased again after the Second World War and then started to decline again in the 60s. So this really baffled demographers. And Becker thought that he could provide a better framework for making sense of these kinds of changes. And he changed the level of analysis from the macro level to the micro level. So I'm getting some feedback. Oh, okay. So he, from these kind of historical trends of production to individual behavior, and placed individual behavior, so in a way human agency rather than structural factors, at the heart of his approach. And this was a really radical, you know, epistemological step to take for a field, especially that hadn't really changed its overall epistemological approach in decades, and didn't change it until sort of the 70s and 80s. So this way of thinking, which in Becker's approach, seeing supply and demand, a marketplace, as it were, taking place in all aspects of life, was, in a way, it was so uncommon then, and now is so commonplace that sometimes I find it really difficult to challenge that and problematize that, and to appreciate how radical his suggestion was. And indeed, Becker's work was rejected by demographers and, you know, people working in that area, areas of fertility and in other disciplines, for about 2 decades. They dismissed it and said that it was treating humans like machines and that it bore no relevance to their work and so on. So it wasn't something that was taken up immediately and accepted. It kind of took a while for people to find that work and find it useful. But yeah, so he was being very clear that he was introducing an economic approach to fertility, and with a particular understanding of what economics meant. So I like to refer to his book, An Economic Approach to Human Behavior, that he published in 1971. That's a collection of various, you know, main essays that he produced by then, and he adds an introduction to it where he gives a really nice definition, I think, for what economics, you know, signifies to him, that I think is relevant across his work. So he says that economics is not defined by its subject matter, such as markets or production chains, or even labor, but rather its particular ontology. So it's methodological approach, which is centered on, you know, his understanding of human behavior. And this, he says, has three assumptions. First, that human behavior is utility maximizing. Second, that markets coordinate the actions of different participants so that their behavior becomes mutually consistent. And third, that people have stable preferences over time. And he says that these three statutes, quote, used relentlessly and unflinchingly, form the heart of the economic approach, end quote. And he was also very aware of the innovation that this approach represented. He said, quote, the economic approach is uniquely powerful because it can integrate a wide range of human behavior, end quote. So it's radical because it's not just looking at a limited domain or a certain number of domains of human activity, but all aspects of human activity and existence can be systematically subjected to an economic analysis, because if economics as a discipline is now defined by its ontology of human behavior rather than its object. So reproduction too can be refigured as a utility maximizing decision exercised by individuals based on their personal preferences in the marketplace, rather than it occurring, for instance, due to human instinct or being determined by modes of production. So how does he then argue this specifically occurs? So if we're thinking about, this kind of consuming subject as the subject of reproduction, he argues that children are like commodities. They're desired by parents who represent kind of the consumers, and they're desired for their utility. He says mainly this utility is mainly psychological satisfaction, but also potentially they provide additional income in some contexts. And as like all commodities do, they cost money. To keep up, to feed, to maintain, and so on, educate, and so on. So the number of children, he says, in a family was determined by the demand for them relative to their cost to parents. So how much a family could afford to spend on them. A fall in fertility was the result of a fall in the demand for children due to their increased cost, as a result of which parents would be prompted to invest more in their quality. So put differently, fertility declined because people preferred to have fewer children of better quality rather than more children that were of poorer quality. And to be clear, Becker wasn't necessarily concerned with declining fertility as such in the 1960s, but rather with fertility. I think he was more interested in fertility transition theory in general and kind of providing a different framework for it. And I think this is because fertility rates were still above replacement level in the United States and the West at the time, which is above 2.1 children per woman in her lifetime. And it was the population explosion, so-called explosion of the global South, that was more of a concern in the 60s. So I think when in his later work, when the early signs of fertility are starting to emerge and be a political concern, I think then we see Becker engaging more with explicitly the problem of women in the labor force. And this is evident in his treatise on the family that he published in 1981, that received a particular mention also when he received the Nobel Prize. And here he notes specifically the mass entry of women into the labor force as the cause of falling fertility rates. And this he kind of rationalizes specifically in terms of that it was the increase in women's wages that made the sexual division of labor, marriage, and having children less attractive, because the gains from them were reduced. So they were not as utility maximized, they weren't as beneficial for women anymore. So also divorce, delayed childbearing, or even childlessness become more attractive to women. But as I said, Becker was largely dismissed and ignored by demographers till about the 1980s, when his work suddenly became this newfound gospel. And in obituaries when he died in 2014, he was hailed as the main influence on contemporary demography. So a real kind of turnaround in his reception. But I mean, there can be sort of haven't specifically, maybe I could do much more detailed research on this, but what I propose and why he became so popular were the following. First, I think the legitimation of human capital theory in the development context was an important precursor for, other than development demographers, but European demographers and Western demographers, to appreciate.
Here's what I found.
Oh, my watch is trying to talk to me. Sorry. They kind of the people working with human capital theory in the development context appreciated the importance of women's labor for economic development rather than seeing it as a problem, and that I think Becker does see women's labor as framed rather as a problem, whereas people like Theodore Schultz and T. Paul Schultz, they framed it as a significant factor for development. And this, I think, legitimized the human capital theory approach, also then for demographers, and giving a different kind of perspective on what could be done with this approach, that it could, was framed in more, let's say, more empowering terms. Second, simply the turn to Becker was a response to the diminishing usefulness of demographic transition theory, which didn't provide many tools for examining so-called post-transitional societies, so societies that were past the, were industrialized basically. And finally, I think it was a framework that, by all appearances, avoided the pitfalls of more interventionist approaches that have been criticized by feminists and anti-colonialists. For instance, overtly pronatalist policies, but also antinatalist policies. And it gestured towards policies that could alter the surrounding factors that influenced women's fertility choices and thereby influence fertility, rather than seeking to directly control women's bodies. And so it's this focus on, the human agency, of a certain kind of human agency, so the ability of, understood as the ability of women to make choices, that resonated very strongly with second wave feminist rhetoric on reproductive choice. And this was then also appealing to demographers and development economists working in the global South, because it could, it provided an alternative way to engage with fertility without falling into accusations of I guess, sexism and racism. But I mean, I think we'll also go into this discussion more. I think it's a point that me and Miriam and I were also interested in exploring further. I think I'm going to leave it there, actually. I think I've talked for about 15 minutes already. And, we can expand on any or many of these points. But I think I've just tried to give an overview of what his approach to fertility was, why it was seen as important, and, a sense of the impact that it's had.
Sure. So thank you very much, Jemima. Would it make sense to, so you've provided an account of why Becker became popular in the context of a transition theory by demographers that placed the locus of change in industrialization rather than in the sorts of considerations that Becker had featured. So this is about, in a way, his popularity his increasing popularity in a discipline like demography. How does this fit, do you think, with the way in which Becker himself contextualized the sorts of problems that were important to him?
I mean, I think this is probably where your research, I think, has probably more to say, in that I think, in many ways, Becker is a eclectic thinker in I think he's both very focused and very eclectic. So he's very focused in that he's extremely devoted to his economic approach, but then he's applied it to, so many different sociopolitical phenomenon like crime and racial discrimination and the list goes on. And I mean, the sense I got from the work is that, that this is something that just took his interest in the 60s. And this be because I haven't, maybe there's some other archival work to be done there to understand specifically what motivated him. But in terms of how he narrates it in his first article on an economic analysis of fertility, he's explaining it very much in terms of the inadequacies of demographic transition theory. And but then I think then his agenda starts to change also later in his work. So his work, I think, becomes more I guess, normatively loaded in the 80s and the 90s. We start to see, for instance, I mean, one example of this is in the Treatise of the Family already. We see that he discusses why there is a sexual division of labor in the family. And he says that this exists in nuclear families simply as the result of historical utility maximization. That, and he starts to explain major historical developments in these terms. He says that men worked in the labor market because they were better at maximizing their efficiency there, and women worked at home because they were better at maximizing their efficiency at home. And, I think it's quite interesting because then it's actually, I think, in contrast to the earlier framework that perhaps was interested in explaining behavior, now he's explaining, major structural phenomena on the basis of, and quite conservatively. So, he's using this framework to retrospectively rationalize major historical developments that I'm not sure we can reduce to the level of individual choices so easily. And so I'm not sure where he's drawing the line between explanation and kind of a normative view. Because the problem I have with this is that, you could explain anything retrospectively through this approach by just making this statement. This has just always been a utility maximizing approach. And, so in a way it becomes almost tautological. And I think that's where it starts to become very conservative as well, because it doesn't really give a reason also for or any alternative ways to understand social and political phenomena. For instance, the concept of power, and how power has been pervasive in society, has no place for the explanation of our reality. So, and what I find really, what I still juggle in my head with about Becker is that, Becker's work can be used, or the way it's been used has been used for various different political agendas. And this is, I guess, where we were to, where our work has also shown that difference, and specifically when thinking about the multiple legacies of Gary Becker, is that European welfare states have embraced this understanding of fertility and used it as a basis for their gender equality policy. So, so in brief, for European demographers, because the cost of children has increased, the policy solution is to make them less costly. And so that means investing in childcare, giving tax breaks to families with children, for instance, supporting women to return to work after maternity leave. So they dovetail very neatly with kind of certain feminist goals. But this is Gary Becker, who we think of as a neoliberal, and that hence not necessarily a very welfare-friendly economist. And I find that really fascinating how this work morphs and shifts. And I guess one of the reasons I kind of started to think about this a lot was also because I had a friend who worked in the nudge unit, so the behavioral insights uh, uh, company that follows the kind of the Pinker nudge sort of stuff that still has this behavioral approach to analyzing social problems. And my friend is very much a social democrat, believes strongly in the welfare state, and yet this approach, at the first time I encountered that many years ago, I was a bit like, oh, there's a I hadn't really thought about that because I had always approached the neoliberal thought from, I guess, a very critical perspective that assumed that it was always a conservative project. So I'm really interested in understanding these weird contradictions of how this kind of thought becomes also adopted by welfare states. And I guess it becomes a part of this neoliberal welfare state as well. And I think there is a connection there, right? Because welfare states are neoliberalizing and they're interested in economic efficiency. So gender equality policy in this sense is a win-win. It's supposed to increase economic competitiveness, women's participation in the labor market, and increase fertility, so produce kind of the next generation of workers. But I don't think that was Becker's vision. So.
Sure. And what would you say if I was to hazard my own view that Becker has one of Becker's key concerns, which around poverty, family limitation, fertility related to poverty in industrialized working class families in particular, no longer really agrarian, agricultural poverty, but industrialized industrial poverty. It seems to me that Becker often does go back to the idea that poverty for him is the key, the most important problem that economists face. And he seems to say this on a number of occasions across interviews. I'm wondering whether it comes to the fore mainly from the 90s onwards. There's only the briefest discussion of poverty in the 1960s work, although Theodore Schultz, using in part a similar framework, received his Nobel Prize for poverty in the global south, looking at children as the poor man's capital. But from the 1990s onwards, he seems to link human capital very strongly to the alleviation of poverty and sees the family as central here, because the family it's like the family comes in to help him explain why human capital is so central to the alleviation of poverty and the family's role in cultivating human capital. And he says at one point, the main purpose of economics, quote, is to understand and help alleviate poverty. And another quote, raising people out of poverty is one of the key roles of the economist. It has always motivated me and it still motivates me. So I'm wondering whether the family, if you like, you were looking at the missing link in demography in your article in relation to human capital and family and so forth. It seems to me like the family is the missing link for Becker, which is why it comes from the 1980s onwards between human capital and growth and human capital and population change in ways that are able to alleviate poverty. And that I see a continuity then between the approach and the previous approaches that we've seen in the 19th century, I guess, in that sense. So I guess, what was the concerns, I guess, were there any concerns among the demographers who ended up taking up Becker with poverty? Was that mainly in the global South demographers, and was it not really an issue for the European demographers who you've said were mainly concerned with how to make children less costly so as to maintain a replacement level of fertility? And that doesn't seem to have anything to do with poverty anymore. Just your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Have never gotten the sense that the problem is necessarily poverty. Probably because this is coming from, these are welfare states, that I think it's more like the eventual threat that people will fall into poverty, but not existing poverty, right? So because the concern is if the welfare state collapses, there'll be all these structures that prevent most people from falling into dire poverty, will not be there. So, so I guess it is there on the horizon in a sense. That's the big danger, right? That's never maybe explicitly spoken, but when you think about it, that's what the welfare state is there for, to improve the quality of people's life. So, and I think, but that is much more explicit in the development context with demographers, and especially like development economists. And also, so like you mentioned, Theodor Schultz, he was definitely, he was explaining his whole interest in terms of the quality of people's lives in global South. And he was, I think it's interesting, like you said, this contrast between Becker interested in industrial society. Schultz was much more interested in agrarian societies. But yeah, and I mean, in a way, that's what human capital theory comes down to in general, when you think about it. What is it? The normative goal is to enable people to be more productive, to, enhance their quality. So it's about enhancing the quality of people in terms of their education, and their health and well-being. So this is probably why human capital theory is so valuable for development economists, but also development policy. Like, so much of global development policy is now centered around human capital, because it's a new framework for thinking about poverty, which we can also criticize. Like, why is this a problem then? I mean, it sounds very good to be wanting to lift people out of poverty, but it's a very particular kind of framework that doesn't really ask why people are in poverty, and then, is it misdiagnosing perhaps also the causes, and then hence providing solutions that maybe won't be as effective as they should be.
Sure. So we've tackled the question broadly of what the problem was, to which Becker saw his own work as a solution, and also what the problem was to which the demographers saw Becker's work as helping them to resolve. And we've seen how there are overlaps, but there are differences as well in the definition of what constitutes that problem. And we've also looked at the different answers to those questions. You've shown how in the European context, it wasn't immediately about poverty, but rather again about the reproduction rate, making kids less costly through the promotion of gender equality with human capital, an explanatory aspect of that change and transition. Could I turn this now to the topic of the webinar more explicitly, about access to abortion and contraception here? So what role, if any, does access to abortion and access to contraceptive knowledge and contraceptive technologies play in the work of the demographers, both in the development context and the European context?
So I think we both had a look at this, right, and found that that in fact it seems to factor very minimally, if not at all, in having an influence on fertility either way, right? So in a way, I guess, I think, well, Becker would say that yes, access to contraceptives is one thing, but it's not the deciding factor. The deciding factor is the cost of children.
Yeah.
But at the same time, so I have also, this isn't the stuff that I've researched in sort of depth, but just kind of in preparation for this talk. But there is also recent research that has kind of tried to. So Becker himself and Schultz, both of the Schultzes, there's two kind of Schultzes who've been very involved, but didn't really have a lot to say about this. But more recent research has also said that actually, because more restrictive abortion access means that girls drop out of school are more likely to drop out of school. Hence, liberal abortion policies can be associated with higher female secondary school enrollment, and therefore enhance parental investment in the human capital of their female children. So the idea is that, well, so if a girl becomes pregnant, they have to interrupt their education, and therefore that destroys their educational and has human capital accumulation opportunities. So sons are more likely to complete their education, and so parents tend to invest more of their human capital in them. And this is what leads to the gender gap in education. And the context of this this research that was done was sub-Saharan Africa. So that this becomes linked to the sustainable and millennium development goals and so on. So though we can't see this being, this is not something that was discussed by Becker, this kind of angle, and I think it's not abortion and contraceptive independently is having an influence, but an influence because of the impact they have on human capital and hence on fertility, which is then, I think, an important distinction to make. But yeah. I can't say how pervasive that perspective is as yet.
That's right. It's hard sometimes to disentangle Becker's own views on particular things from the way that other economists might be able to use this model to speak about particular issues, which the two are quite different often. But if we do go back for the people in the webinar right now and have a look at the actual pages where Becker mentions abortion or contraception, Jemima and I went back and had a bit of a look at treatise and kind of picked out all the times Becker referred to abortion. There aren't many, and contraception, and we discovered that he seems to be presenting abortion and contraception as techniques that have existed since ancient times, that are already known and already being used. There's no discussion of a need for legal access to abortion or to contraception in Becker. And he explicitly presents the pill as not the cause of any drop in fertility, because actually people have already been able to access contraception for a very long time. So that's on pages 140, 143, 144. 144 states explicitly women have already been able to access abortion and contraception anyway. And page 369 and page 362 even potentially imply that it's okay for abortions to be restricted to accord with moral norms. So it's like he's accepting whatever is happening in the background culture as as an expression of those legal norms that have emerged over time to express or frame utility maximization endeavors. And it seems to me that this supports a view of the women's movements, where Becker does also say quite explicitly at one point in time, the women's movements were not a driver of social change. They were really an emotional support. For changes in the labour market that were driving social change. So the cause is high wages for women in the tertiary sector, leading women to want to have market-relevant human capital. The cause is the rise of that tertiary sector post-war, in the post-war period, and the desire for human capital. And that meant that there was a push by social movements to have greater access to abortion, greater access to contraception, to change laws to facilitate this. But these were an effect of a more fundamental change, which was changes to the labour market. And I've always found that a little odd to think that the driver was really not the women's movement at all. Since it merely offered emotional support.
Yeah. I mean, it says what he thinks about the feminist movement, but definitely very clearly. And what's furthermore quite interesting is T. Paul Schultz, who's also been really important in kind of human capital theory and development economics. He wrote in the 1990s, I think it was the book Economic Investment. I haven't written it down what it was. It was the investment in women's human capital or something like this. And he wrote then that that human capital was the most effective way of delivering what he said was intra-household resource allocation, or socioeconomic equality. And he said that was, human capital was much more effective. Human capital development was much more effective than civil and marriage rights for women, more equal taxes and transfers, or even participation in the labor force. And this Schultz, he had a long history of engaging with feminist economists like Esther Boserup and Claudia Golden. And, so he kind of, when I read his work, I get that strong sense that he shares more egalitarian motivations, but, even he's of the opinion that it's not even labor force participation as such, but human capital development that's the driving force of women's equality, which is, I think, when you say that, it's almost like a step further from Becker. I mean, obviously, I think there's linkages there, but I guess it's the precursor, right? Like, probably the assumption I would think is that you need to have a human capital accumulation, and then you can access the labor market in a more beneficial way, and then hence this brings more equality.
Yeah, sure. Rebecca's posted a question. Do you want to speak to that, Rebecca? It's an interesting, and we're just open to people as well.
Yeah, well, I have two short comments. One more general, that what surprised me most, and when I, for example, when I do my course on history of feminist economics, and I start with the debates in the 1970s between Barbara Bergman and Gary Becker. What surprised me most is this explicitly separation that in particular Becker wants to do, trying to develop a pure theory of human capital, a part of and apply economics, a part of social and civil rights movement and what is happening all around the world, not only in the United States, but in France, in Latin America, in Asia, in different parts of the world. So if he's a part in his Department of Economics at Chicago, in his office, writing his, and trying to make like a strong theory, a strong, sound theory that he can sell all around the world, and he can impose all around the world. So for me, and of course, always these theories have also political implication. But I have the impression that one of the aim is to do an applied economic theory that can explain, the market, the labor market, and the human capital theory, etc. So this is one comment, and I want to hear what you think about this, the relation between politics and economics in these theories. And the second is like more on the contextual aspect, because it's very difficult to find, open positions about abortion. What do you think? Are you in favor or are you against? What is your personal position? And, I contact Shoshana Gosper, who wrote her dissertation with Gary Becker, and ask her, like, do you have any, because she published a lot, and with other Beckers and Schultz students, I asked them if they explicitly work on abortion, and they say, no, we work on, fertility, we work on divorce, we work on, but not on abortion. So I wonder if there is also something more personal, because all of this is super political, very linked with if you are Democrat, Republican, or also religious. So, there are many Catholics, Jewish, Protestant, Muslim, etc., that they don't assume publicly their position. So I wonder if you have any clue, any information about this. But thank you very much, because for this information that you're giving us.
Those are super interesting questions. I definitely want to hear sometime more about your discussions with Becker students. Those must be very, very interesting. With regards to abortion, I think it's a very difficult one to answer, because on one hand, I don't feel that Becker was ever shy about discussing controversial topics. Especially when, in his work on crime and punishment, he makes almost arguments, that about various illegal activities like drug use, but also abortion is mentioned there as one of the illegal activities back when it was, pre-Roe versus Wade. And, kind of throws it in the air like, oh, we should, maybe think about, whether it is actually beneficial to have these restrictions on some of these, and what would be the kind of most effective way of reducing these illegal activities. So from that, I often get the sense, and when it comes to many things, fertility and so on, he's a very pragmatic kind of thinker. And that doesn't mean that he's not aware of his own biases. But it's hard to say what they are, because he never really, or maybe they come through, especially in his later work. It's more political, and I think Miriam has much more to say on that. But it definitely is, I think he likes to think of himself as a very scientific, pragmatic person that isn't swayed by morality as such, but rather, scientific approach. But of course, we know that there's no such, at least I would subscribe to the view that there is no such thing as such, right? Like, I think just the questions that he chooses to pose are very clearly already have a lot of assumptions laid within them. So that's my non-answer to your question. And also the politics and economics so I have to confess, I haven't read a lot of his later work, and this is why I defer to Miriam here, because I've been very interested in the fertility stuff, which is much earlier, where I know that he's written more about democracy and so that, you know, relationship economics and politics. But if what you say is correct, then I think it's very surprising that, you know, he's making this argument that his approach can be applied to, you know, any aspect of human existence, but then yet if he sees that actually is related to, restricted to the social and not to the political, if that's what you're saying, then I find that, you know, yeah, just a bit surprising, and I'd be interested to know why he thinks that. But when it comes to politics, I think he's very, like, in general, his work is very depoliticizing, and the example of the women's movement is basically, you know, captures that very much, that he doesn't think that politicking can have a very important impact on people's lives. Everything, the best change can be by kind of devising the appropriate incentives to direct human behavior in, I guess, what he would see as a more rational direction. But please, Miriam, I would be also very interested to hear your response to those questions.
I don't have too much to say on the first one that Rebecca asked. I think you already answered that very well in raising the, in identifying how he was willing to talk about controversial topics in other areas. What I find interesting with Becker is that there's a sense in which he's quite happy to accept that the economic approach can lead to very divergent views on the role, and almost opposed views on the role of government. And he often, that means, explicitly states that we need empirical evidence rather than the deductive rational choice approach that might support a view on government's role. So, for example, in the 1991 version of the treatise, the supplement to that book makes an argument that there may very well be a need for extensive social security for ageing populations in order to provide the institutional conditions in a context where parents and children cannot be held to rational promises. So if parents and children are going to come together and discuss a quid pro quo arrangement where parents invest in the human capital of their children to thereby be able to access care from their children in their later lives when they're aging, using inheritance to compel children to offer care. That's actually not going to happen because children can't be held to the promise to provide that care in old age. And so the argument is that social security and care for an ageing population is necessary when children can't be held to their promises. On the other hand, he often allows himself on many occasions in interviews and so forth to express deeply political positions about being very much in favour of a limited government. Government changes incentives. Government is actually an expression of partisan interests, political interest itself, and that, you know, it has distorting effects. So the it's not clear what political position an economic approach could lead to in this sense. But if we just look at Becker, he permits himself to make to take up political positions in relation to, in my view, those families that he expresses in interviews are the ones that are most deeply problematic in the provision of human capital for their children. So there is a segment of population. This goes back to why the discussion with Bernard Harcourt, Francois Ewald, and Gary Becker is so important in this context. And it's not a paper or a discussion that economists or historians of economic thought normally pay much attention to, but it's a discussion that shows just how, where Becker actually accepts his description by Foucault as, and his account of human capital and so forth. And Bernard Harcourt asks him, one of the Foucault's view is that a theory that focuses on the development of human capital as the panacea to a variety of social problems presents itself as a kind of power without coercion, but it's not, according to Foucault. It leads to the view that there are populations that are not worth investing in. And we do find, in my view, in Becker's work, that the problem of poverty in the latter half of the 20th century is really Black single mums who are having children whose human capital they can't afford to invest in properly, and they should be having less children, and they're being incentivized to have more children because of the aids to families with dependent children. And so it's an argument in many cases that we need to remove the incentivization of these families to have children that they can't afford, and remove those aids to families with dependent children. And that is a political position that doesn't necessarily follow on from an economic approach per se, but one that we find in Becker's work. Of course, other economists who are working with Becker's tradition, Becker's methodology and approach, the economic approach, have done something quite different with this. But it's still a political position that's deeply problematic in Becker's work, in my view, that does make it about, that does mean that it's a human capital here is a form of power, and it is also coercive in that sense. Yeah.
I mean, is there anything to sort of expand on too? Then how does he see, if I can ask you a question, like, I guess Black women's human capital, the problem of Black women's human capital, because so when he was writing in 1962, he was he forms this, this notion of the cost of children and so on. He used on Jacob Minster's 1962 study on the allocation of time in households, which is based on the experience of white married women. And Minster deliberately didn't include Black women's time allocation because he thought it would just make it too complicated, right? And so white married women were largely, housewives in the 60s. So basically, he's talking about mainly housewives, white housewives, but Black women were more likely to be single parent households and working, right? And so in a way, sometimes I'm wondering, does this kind of challenge the viability of the explanation of the labor market, if not the kind of, at least how it's applied to the question of gender inequality and so on, if it doesn't seem to fit, right? This it only seems applicable to a certain group of women, because if Black women are already in labor, then how does, yet they aren't seen as very I guess, productive, right? So they're not able to nonetheless lift themselves out of poverty. And so how does Becker rationalize that? What are they doing wrong? I mean, okay, yes, there's a question of incentives, but then I wonder, how does he explain that phenomenon? Does he, or does he just ignore it?
I'll go to the questions in a moment, but I'll just say my view there. He, in a very interesting comment, says that slavery is responsible for the differences in stability in families between Black, assuming homogeneity in couples, which is itself problematic, but he's writing at a particular time. He assumes that Black African-American couples, families are less stable because the Black women are earning more in relation to their male partner's wage than white women were earning in relation to their partner's wage. So the difference was larger in white couples than it was in Black couples. So for Becker, he felt that this could explain the instability in Black families, where it was more interesting to a Black woman to find utility outside of a marriage. And he says this is actually the effect of slavery. And he refers to a study on differences in wages and the implication that this is derived from a history of slavery. But he doesn't go into that at all. So there is an extent to which this framework can be potentially useful in talking about the differences between investments in human capital, wage differentials, family stability, and so forth. But I guess might need to go back to that slavery issue.
Yeah, no, I think that's super interesting.
Yeah. We'll go to the, can I go back up here to Daniel? Who came into the chat here first? So
Niels.
Niels, would you speak to this point? Because it was very interesting, I thought.
Yes, my question was a little bit simple. Just I can't repeat what I wrote. So maybe I misunderstood some things that you said, but the theory of Becker is not very old. So my question is, do you think that Becker still have an influential contemporary economic in the demographic analysis, and especially in the academic world? Do you think Becker still is an economist that is very influential?
Yeah, I think yes. I think I think a lot has happened since him, and I think there's a lot of economists have further developed his work and used it for different ways. But I feel like in the beginning of many articles you read, especially in demography, the very first two paragraphs will have that reference to Becker to signal, you know, this is where their starting point is, and then they'll go on to the more recent stuff. But you know, it always comes back to Becker again and again, and also in the development context when we talk, you know, him or Theodore Schultz, they reappear again and again. In other aspects, I think he's more seen as a forefather to other things like behavioral economics. So, you know, behavioral economics, as I've understood it, you know, it sees, you know, alters, I guess, the framework by not seeing human behavior as rational, but as fundamentally irrational, that people kind of make the wrong choices for themselves. So we have to help them make the right choices. But you know, and then they see that, oh, we don't do the same thing as Becker. But for me, that's you know, Becker is the forefather of that approach. So you know, and there's a lot of this, like, and this is, you know, very much in social psychology and various kind of policy policy initiatives and consultancies that are just purely about this approach as well. So I think Becker has really wide influence both in kind of the world of governance, in gender equality, demography, social policy, to some extent economic policy when we talk about labor participation, but also academically. So academically, he's still there too, very much. And for demography, he's still the main person that now basically completely dominates demographic work in academia.
Thank you.
Daniel.
I just had a thought going back to this question of Becker and abortion. And I may be unfair not remembering everything that Becker's worked on, but I generally think of him as working with a unitary model of the family. And one of the criticisms that comes in is alternative collective models of the family, where there's bargaining between men and women that determines family decision making, as opposed to the unitary model. And if he does stick with the unitary model, it does seem like abortion rights might constrain the family when they ultimately make their fertility decision, impose costs on that fertility decision, but it doesn't affect the bargaining between family members in the way that a collective model of the family would. So I was wondering if that might be relevant to Becker and abortion, and that might not even be the correct way of thinking about Becker's approach. It's been a little while.
Again, we probably need Shoshana for this, because Shoshana's done work on whether Becker's model of the household really was always unitary, or whether it also involved different models of the household which permitted the sort of bargaining, non-cooperative bargaining models. So that's not really, I can't speak to that at all. We do need her expertise, or somebody who knows those models and their variety in Becker's work. I'd be interested to see whether or not access to legal access to abortion would actually change the nature of bargaining within a family. I think it would. I'd say it definitely would change the nature of bargaining, because one can then see the sorts of decision opportunities and constraints are very different then, I guess. Yeah, it's a very interesting point.
Yeah, and I think we find Becker doing a bit of both, maybe, because at least in his early work, it's very much, he talks about the household, and he's interested in the household as a single, unit. But that, again, I think it changes with the treaties in the 80s, and that work that he starts to think more. And I think the problem of women's labor, I think, just kind of rattles him and gets him to think more carefully about the relationships within the family. But early on, I think he was very much inspired by like all the earlier work in household economics, and so he that's kind of his starting point. But yeah, I like Miriam, I can't really say anymore. But really interesting question.
Jerome, I missed your earlier comment about how problems that Becker faced might not have just been of the nature that we were talking of, and the sad case of him selecting a problem based on his own more tragic circumstances. I can see you got your hand up for another entry point to the discussion. Please go ahead. Can't hear. Can't hear you for some reason.
Maybe take out your headphones. You are mute.
Can you hear me now?
Wait.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. No, I had to change my settings here. Strangely, it doesn't pick up that I've got something in. Yeah, sorry, I'm on campus and we've got some student protests and security is running around here, so there might be some noise as well. So I'm not using the computer audio. So I wanted to comment on more on the beginning of the conversation, and Becker's approach to population theory, because I think it's often presented as a very novel work, as you've done yourself as well, Jemima. But in the mid 60s, he actually wrote a paper before he started, or while he was still thinking about this. I think he was a young man then, and he said that he was trying to basically put Malthus into modern language. And in fact, his work is very Malthusian. And I think he's kind of managed to do that, retaining some of the elements of Malthusian thoughts and putting them in like microeconomic stuff. But actually, because this also relates to the question whether he's still influential, there's a whole strand of literature which basically started in the early 2000s, but has some earlier thoughts, earlier sources in the 20th century, about what they're calling the demographic window. So this opportunity that a country supposedly has when, working age people exceed the children. I mean, the young dependents, before the country now has a large old population, which then negates that effect again in the course of the demographic transition. And many people use Becker's works for explaining the demographic transition. And yeah, sorry if I'm long, but I wrote a paper on that. But the thing is, the explanation totally actually negates the historical experience of the demographic transition, because the demographic transition starts with a huge mortality decline, and in particular, infant mortality decline, historically in Europe and everywhere else it's taking place. And in fact, this whole literature doesn't deal with mortality at all. They deal only with fertility. And what you explained about women as assets or investment goods, with human capital now becoming important in an urban industrial society, and therefore women becoming children becoming more expensive because you have to invest in them. It doesn't tell us at all why one of a sudden that would be the case. So it's actually starting from a situation where we are already in a developed country and not looking at the history of how we got there. And as such, I think what's very important is what I don't know if it's Miriam or Jemima, you said it. I think with the fact you can't really explain, macro historical, sociological phenomena by only individual choices, which is of course a problem in economics in general, where he doesn't take into account such things as the pension system and child care so that women can go to work, etc. It's all based on individual choices, as if social policy and the institutional historical context doesn't matter. And yeah, I think that probably has a bearing also on the question of abortion and reproductive rights. So that's basically where I wanted to get to. Yeah.
And what bearing does it have?
Well, I don't know. I haven't asked myself that question, but surely, abortion is also something that either is legalized and is available to women, as a public service, or, it's performed individually by some or whatever, and there's a lot of mortality related to it, which is often the case when it's not legal. So I think these things do matter. They're not just individual choices. They are part of a social policy and
Okay. No, thanks. I think that's a really interesting point, and confess I haven't really thought about the mortality point, which is really obvious. But yeah, I wonder why he doesn't, you know, maybe it's also the problem of being so focused on explaining a single phenomenon, right? Because it doesn't necessarily focus on the interrelation between different phenomenon, right? And also mortality is something that can't be necessarily, you know, integrated into the framework of choice, you know, except when it comes to suicide, perhaps, which you also mentioned. But, you know, it's probably like, you know, kind of, maybe, I wonder if it has this, it's just pure speculation, but, you know, Miriam was saying about how abortion and contraception are just these things that happen. And then, you know, so it's pointless to think about them because it's fertility, because maybe mortality doesn't affect fertility so much. Or if it does, the way that mortality does affect fertility then is because when you have fewer children, so more children surviving, then you start to focus on the quality of those children rather than their quantity. So mortality then actually for him is a variable that affects choice, you know, it affects the utility maximizing decision, but for him it's not a factor that he considers, I guess, significant to think about demographic transition as a variable in itself, akin to fertility. So yeah, maybe I think that might be how he thinks about it.
Yeah, and maybe he wasn't actually even trying to explain the demographic transition. Is mostly how his work was used later, right? Because he was clearly thinking in a context of, you know, the US or another developed country. He wasn't a development economist, unlike Schultz, was interested in, you know, agrarian change, etc. So I think that might be also the problem, that people use work from a certain context and then they want to extrapolate. He did clearly have the ambition to explain certain population phenomena that, yeah, but even Malthus doesn't really do that. It doesn't explain the demographic transition. So if he wants to start with Malthus, maybe also that's the wrong.
Yeah, it's true what you say about Malthus.
I just wanted to say about the thing about suicide, that was not from me. It's another Harcourt, because you mentioned Bernard Harcourt, but this is Geoff Harcourt actually, who told me this. I think he probably didn't know him, so he died recently, but it was 90s. Probably all know Harcourt.
Sorry, I couldn't hear that last bit very well.
Oh, sorry, I'm saying it's not me. Who said that he found out. And it's not him. Hear me now?
You can write in the chat.
Better?
Oh, there we go.
Okay, sorry, I don't know what happened. No, I'm saying the bit on suicide was not my research or my finding. It's Geoff Harcourt, who's another, because you mentioned Harcourt earlier, but Geoff Harcourt was a big post-Keynesian economist, and he told me that bit about Becker. I don't know where he got it from, that it was actually motivated by the suicide of his wife, but I would think he probably knew what he was talking about.
My anecdote about Becker's wife is the first time I got treaty. I checked out the first time I read the treatise. I checked it out from the library to see if it was worth looking at, and somebody had, because he dedicates it to his wife, and somebody had written in pencil underneath, who took all my notes and did all the labor for me in the background. Anyway, those just I don't know if anybody's read Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner, but it's kind of a similar vibe. Yeah.
Now I think Rebecca has to go because she's going to go teach. Do you think we've come to a natural close? Because I had in my notes here, how should we finish? Bring it back to abortion, contraception, reproductive rights at the end. And Jerome has done that for us. So I think it's a nice finishing point to the seminar. And I just wanted to thank you all for your contributions to the discussion. and Jemima in particular for leading such an interesting and nuanced presentation and discussion with us all. So thank you.
No,